So I want to welcome all of you, especially all of these lovely science students that are here with us, who we don't generally have join us. So welcome to all of you who've not been to an art lecture before. This series is called the Art Lecture Series, but it is really interdisciplinary because using art sort of as the central node for the interdisciplinarity, art takes as its subject the society around it, the environment around it, and the individual, how the individual interacts. So everything is our subject, so anybody can come and present here. So I also want to say that there is an overflow room, though I think we have room in here, and people, if anyone is in the overflow room, feel free to come over. And certainly if you're over there and you have a question for our speaker, to come at the end during the Q&A period and join us in here, because the streaming is just one way. And so quickly to say that how this is set up for those of you who have not been here, the lecture usually is about an hour, the presentation, and with a half an hour at the end for Q&A. And we expect this to be, the reason this is important that it's live and not recorded if possible, is that this is a dynamic conversation that we're having with people coming to our campus. So the questions that come from the students and faculty at the end are really enlivening and important, so please participate. And it is also not the time to get up and leave and interrupt that flow. So this will be an hour-and-a-half presentation, just to forewarn you. I also, at the beginning and the end, so this is the last lecture for the quarter, it's week 10, obviously. So I like to thank all the people that support this and let us know that this effort is a collective effort on the part of there's an administrative support person, Julie Ron, that helps welcome the speakers and give them instructions and the contract. There are facilities people that help us get the rooms and schedule them and give us priority for them, and that's Shannon Stewart and Karen Johnson in this particular building. And then there are electronic media people who really are incredibly helpful for the speaker to set up their presentations, and then we record these and they're available on YouTube for everyone to refer to, and we've had an amazing selection of speakers over the years that you can access. And then we have the media interns who are our students here who do the actual recording. And then I just want to, before we introduce Dr. Sarah Maquette Ray, for today, winter quarter, we have 4 speakers coming. If you're interested, it's open to everyone, including the public. And we hold it at this point on even weeks, so weeks 2, 4, 6, and 8 next quarter. We have Marianne Peters, who's an artist who combines studio work, installation, public art projects, and arts activism in week 2. And then they're also on our website. Heidi Hatry is a New York-based German artist known for body-related performances. Kaya Sand is a poet, artist, and teacher. And Bob Leverich is a 3D artist with a background in stone, ceramics, wood, and architecture, and is a professor here. So those are our lectures for winter. And we have Michael Dalton from Political Ecology, who will be introducing Dr. Sarah Maquette Ray. Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name is Michael Dalton and I will be introducing our speaker today. We will be hearing from Sarah Maquette Ray as part of Evergreen's Art Lecture Series. Sarah Maquette Ray is an Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at the Humboldt State University in Arcata, California, where she also leads the Bachelor of Arts program in Environmental Studies. Sarah Maquette Ray is the author of The Ecological Other, a powerful book which I read as part of the Political Ecology program. This book analyzes mechanisms of exclusion and social control, which mainstreams U.S. environmentalism. Let me try that all again. This book analyzes mechanisms of exclusion and social control, which mainstream U.S. environmentalism has enforced on immigrants, Native Americans, and people with disabilities. It also showed how progressive era environmentalism and eugenics were intrinsically tied together. She actively problematizes issues in environmentalism, teaching, and other important fields, which carefully helps to further our understanding of the world around us. Today, she will cover the important role that the arts and humanities play in addressing environmental problems in her talk titled, "What do the arts and humanities have to do with our environmental crisis?" She will also be giving a talk on her next book project called Coming of Age in the Anthropocene, Climate Justice Pedagogies for Resilience, and that will be at UW at 4 p.m. tomorrow if you are interested. It is my privilege and honor to introduce her to you all today. Please help me in welcoming Sarah Maquette Ray.
Okay, I want to echo Dr. Osha's thanks to all the people who helped me put this all together, and really want to thank the Art Lecture Series for bringing me. And all those artists that you have coming in the spring makes me realize it's a good thing those artists are coming, because I won't be speaking a whole lot about the arts itself, but as a humanist and as a person who's teaching students who are thinking a lot about how to engage in artivism and art, environmental work, and collaborating with artists on Humboldt State's campus, it's really been fun to think about what the arts bring as well, so I will end on art. I also want to thank Dr. Shangri-La Joshi, who I went to graduate school at the University of Oregon, who's here. She was seminal in making sure that I was able to come today, and brought the idea to the attention of the Art Lecture Series folks. And because she brought me here, I'm going to open up with a little story in a second about graduate school. That's how I'm going to get us warmed up. I also want to just acknowledge that we're on Squaxin land, and I want to appreciate that. So thank you. So, graduate school. When I was in graduate school, this was in 2003, I started the graduate program at the University of Oregon in the Environmental Sciences Studies and Policy program. I had training in, I had a bachelor's degree in religious studies and women's studies, and a master's degree in American studies from UT Austin. And so I really saw myself as doing humanities work. And I wanted to get into environmental stuff, but there were no places that did environmental studies from a non-science or non-public policy perspective at that time. Now there's a lot of programs in environmental humanities. It's really great. But at the time, somebody had told me about the program at University of Oregon was just adding a humanities track, and they had just hired Ted Toadvine to be the humanities faculty member to do environmental philosophy. And I thought, okay, I'm not a philosopher, but that's great. Humanities are going to have some kind of advocate there. They're going to actually care at all about the humanities in that environmental studies program, even though environmental sciences, studies, and policy doesn't really say that, but I thought I'll give it a try. So I got there, and it turned out that was really exciting and radical that the humanities have been added. Notice the arts haven't even made an appearance yet here in this evolution of environmental studies waking up to this. And we were, as graduate students, asked to TA. I don't know if Shangri-La, did you do this TAing the intro series? So all graduate students had to do this. We had to TA the introductory series for the undergraduates, and the undergraduate classes were about 400 students. They were really big. And so undergraduates would move through the Introduction to Environmental Studies sequence of natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities, the fall term, winter term, and spring term. And this was really cool. I got to experience what this was like. A biologist taught this natural sciences, a geographer taught the social sciences, and Ted taught the humanities, and I got to learn what that looked like. And so interdisciplinarity was kind of ingrained in me as a really interesting question early on. But at the very first day of the natural sciences class, our biology professor asked the class a really good question: what's the difference between the natural sciences, social science, and humanities in approaching the environment? Seemed like a really good question, and I was curious to see what the students would say. And a very eager student rose his hand and said, the natural sciences are in the driver's seat. The social sciences are in the passenger seat, and the humanities are in the back seat. And I was sitting in the front seat, and I was a graduate student, and I was like, that doesn't seem right. There's something wrong with this. And I thought, okay, for one, a humanist, I've now learned, would really be already thinking about, and so would an artist, what had possibly privatized his imagination, maybe BP or Ford, even before he was born, to help him think about the world through a car analogy, right? So that was like the first thing. I was like, I'm getting a literary studies PhD in environmental literature, and I know that that metaphor isn't right, you know? The car. Okay, so we're gonna head towards some sort of ecotopia in a car? No, this can't be right. So I knew there was something wrong with that. But of course I was ruffled, as many humanists might be, at hearing that, to think, well, what about the hierarchy of how knowledge is being produced and how it's being valued? And so that was really a amazing moment, an illustration for me, and it launches what I want to talk about today, about who has the authority to claim knowledge about the environment and who's going to be best equipped to deal with our environmental crisis. And I think you can guess where the arts fit in that car. The trunk, yeah, of course, obviously. So artists, you know, how do you feel about that? Not so great. So that was just unbelievable. I'm going to keep coming back to the car. And my master's thesis was on SUVs, so it was like already a theme in my head. So, okay. So this was a wonderful potential teaching moment, right? The biology professor could have said, aha, what's with that analogy? What's wrong with your head? Or whatever, right? And, but no, he actually, as any siloed academic would, who's interested in consolidating their territory around their disciplines, he took that as a great reflection of how superior his discipline was. And so it was a really lost teaching moment. And I've ever since then been kind of trying to make up for that. So the story sets the stage for my talk today. It's a story I've relived so many times that it's become kind of a meme for me, but I've never had the opportunity, as I've had in this talk, to actually put together some arguments about it, so I'm really excited about what I have to share with you today. And forgive me, as humanists, we spend a lot of time thinking that the craft of our writing and our ideas and all the preparation that goes into putting them into words is really important, so we do often read from our talks. So I will animate and look up, I promise. I lead an environmental studies program, and so I'm always in a position of having to defend what the arts and humanities and even the social sciences add to the environmental studies equation. And we're located in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and not in the College of Natural Resources and Sciences. And so that institutional divide constantly raises this question, what are you doing over there? How is it different? And students and parents are always asking, how is it different? What do you offer that's different? So and also I have to keep students sitting in their seat in my classes instead of taking them out into the field, and they're always wondering, why are we sitting in this classroom? There's problems out there. We got to get out there. So I have to make the case that what we're doing in arts and humanities classes is really compelling, and that we need to do it, right? So I'm excited to do that for you guys today, too. I hope I do that. Okay, so this is a story about how the arts and humanities are mutinying and getting out of the car and conjuring up a more suitable vehicle of collective triumph. So I'll tell this story by way of illustration. I'm going to deconstruct the title of this talk for the next few minutes, which shows you the kinds of tools and methods that humanists can bring to the environmental crisis table. It may feel like a waste of time, but I hope you will go on this journey with me. None of these terms should be left alone or accepted for what we think they mean. Humanists like to look really closely at the work that language does in the world to give things meaning and to move resources around. We call this close reading. The definitions of the words arts and humanities are not set. They're always being contested and rewritten. Thank goodness. So that's my first close reading. Disciplines are always in flux, which I take as a good thing, because disciplinary rigidity is a byproduct of the corporatization of higher education. I am reluctant to clarify these terms, arts and humanities, because I think it's in the best interests of our environmental crisis, which I'll get to in a moment, for us to keep the boundaries between disciplines fluid. That said, the arts and humanities have traditionally brought certain kinds of approaches that I do want to prove to you are important for our environmental crisis. So I'll make my case by showing you, not just telling you, why I think the arts and humanities are unique in doing this. I have a clicker here. Okay, so this term, clicker, power on, thank you. This term should be easier, right? Environmental crisis. People who think that there is any real crisis at all most likely think that others who share the same belief define this term in the same way. We chant the refrain in our sleep, or rather in our nightmares. The apocalypse is upon us, right? Humanity's burnings of fossil fuels is causing rising global temperatures and concomitant crises of sea level rise and warming oceans and biodiversity loss. And do you feel your heart rising? This is like Al Gore in his movie, right? Enumerating the horrors, and we hear it all the time. Those of us who struggle to sleep at night for visions of our environmental crisis dancing in our heads can at least be sympathetic to people who would rather stick those heads in the sand, or worse, dismiss it as a Chinese hoax. Denialism is really appealing when you're tired of existing in a constant state of what psychologists are increasingly calling climate trauma or environmental grief. But what a privilege that this even seems a choice for some of us. You don't have to look at contemporary US politics, though, to find disagreement about what the environmental crisis is. Is it biophysical? Is it an economic one? Is it a moral one? Is it a spiritual one? A cultural one? Political? Aesthetic? The crisis is the wicked problem of our time, in part because of the different ways that even experts in these disciplines will disagree about it. People think that engineers and scientists and possibly politicians and lawyers are going to do all the heavy lifting. But humanists and artists operate in the worlds of imagination, culture, and meaning. What work will need to be done in those worlds? Environmental historian Steve Hartman describes the respective contributions this way. If the processes by which societies negotiate and affect regime changes are neither natural nor comprehensible strictly within the parameters of the natural sciences, then they are cultural transactions subject to political, social, and economic contingencies. He provocatively states that the great environmental predicament of the early 21st century is not primarily an ecological one. Rather, it is a crisis of culture. I agree with Hartman when he says, unpacking the complexities involved in this crisis requires expertise and analytical tools from a panoply of knowledge communities that obviously include the natural sciences while also extending a great deal beyond them. It is precisely because our environmental crisis is truly the wicked problem of our time that game-changing breakthroughs are unlikely to emerge from within the boundaries, or borders, of any individual disciplines. So to wax on about our environmental crisis requires that you explain the crisis in some kind of narrative form. That is, X causes Y causes Z. And that you desire some kind of response, be it cognitive, affective, political, from your audience, right? How we construct crisis narratives has nothing to do with the environment. It has to do with stories we tell, our assumptions about each other, how our ideas about risk are mediated, the arts of persuasion, and how all these things have worked on us, in turn, to shape our own beliefs about our environmental crisis. Let me share an example of what I'm talking about. I recently gave a talk to a freshman general education class. I don't think you guys have that here at Evergreen, do you? Gen Ed? No. Okay. With the dean of my university's College of Natural Resources and Sciences, an eminent biologist and an expert on climate change. He spoke about melting Arctic ice. He used lots of graphs and infographics. He defined climate versus weather. He gave kind of like a 20-minute version of an inconvenient truth. His main purpose seemed to be to equip the students with a basic sense of how to know that climate change is real. If we read between the lines, we can tell that he sees the problem as people needing more quality data to be convinced that climate change is happening. He's intervening in the debate about whether or not climate change is true, which is, of course, the defensive posture that many scientists are taking in the moment, and understandably so. On multiple occasions, my colleague made the point that humans can't perceive climate change, which is why, perhaps he thinks, so many people don't believe it's happening. I can only guess that's why he repeated this point. Climate change cannot be perceived. Having never articulated any particular problem, he concluded with a slide that said, the solution, and the next slide, go to the data. Oh, killing me here. I'm not a quantitative person, I can't do math, just so you. Go to the data is not like an invitation to heaven to me. So what a relief, right? Easy as that. No wonder humanists and artists are not clamoring at the door for this work, right? From his perspective, the problem is that people don't understand or look at data enough to know how climate change is real. Just look at the data and we can all move on. Many students in that room, many of my own colleagues, and many people I meet out and about define the problem this way. as one of not enough information being disseminated to the public. Such a definition of the problem leads people to think that the primary role of humanists and artists is to package, translate, and communicate that information to the public better. Artists, poets, philosophers, humanists, we can dress up the data in a few good quotes by Thoreau or Kant. We could maybe make it a mural on the wall. We can maybe provide some of those soft skills to help the ostensibly socially awkward scientists get their message across. We're the PR. We're the cheerleaders on the sideline of the real action. And this is what life is like in the backseat, right? And so continues the feminization of the arts and humanities. But I digress. Well, would that data would solve our problems, though, okay? That particular problem, even that particular problem that he defined, would that it would solve that problem? Of course, my colleague was not suggesting that the data will solve our environmental crisis. He was just saying that the data will convince us that it exists. What I'm pointing out, though, is how narrowly he was defining the problem and the resulting narrow notion of what we could do about it. Artists, social scientists, and humanists believe that data isn't enough, or at least it only answers one kind of question. Experts in sociology, risk theory, cultural studies, communication, and an array of artists can tell you that providing more data isn't going to convince any more people. This framing of the problem is unfortunate. Our expertises could have saved my colleague a lot of energy and helped him guide him to tell a different story. First, by seeing the problem differently. In her fantastic book, Living in Denial, Kari Norgaard, environmental sociologist, Kari Norgaard challenges this notion that data will save the day. She debunks what she calls the information deficit model. Such a model assumes that if we just had more information, more proof, we could convince people and leaders to mobilize. Steve Hartman similarly observes, one hard lesson that we have learned from the first 5 IPCC assessments is that rising scientific confidence and consensus do not in themselves produce shifts in societal values and norms, or changes in human behavior on a significant scale. Amplification of the scientific message is not the answer to the cultural dilemma we now face. In a time when truthiness and factoids are capable of undercutting the value of facts and scientific validity in the marketplace, this is getting even worse, right? We need to adopt more sophisticated approaches to the dissemination and reception of current scientific knowledge in our societies. This applies not only within our political and social institutions, but even more decisively within the sometimes counterintuitive, messy spheres of mass media and public culture. Thus, the data is only partly useful, even if we accept that the problem it might solve is persuading more people. Dynamic father-son duo Paul and Scott Slovic, famous environmental risk psychologist and founder of environmental literary studies, respectively, co-wrote a fascinating new book on this subject, Numbers and Nerves. In it, they argue that numbers actually have a neutral, if not negative, effect on people. That is, despite what they call the numerical fetish of modern society, numbers are cognitively and emotionally difficult to grasp. I don't know about you guys, but I can never guess the amount of marbles that are in the jar, you know? It's like that. Paul's research has famously shown, for example, that humans change their views or are motivated to act by a story of one person's suffering, more so than they are about information about loads of people suffering. That is, an individual's story about some injustice has greater impact than evidence that injustice is widespread. The Slovics conclude that both numbers and narratives are required to affect personal and social change. So much for a fetishization of data to get people to change their ways. So let's go back to this notion. The solution? Well, thanks to Norgaard and the Slovics, we know that it's not just lack of data, it's dissemination or access to it. Rather, defining the problem, defining the crisis, is much more complicated than most of us believe. How can we even begin to gather data to solve a crisis if we can't describe what it is or agree about what it is? Philosopher Ted Toadvine writes about this. There was a guy back from Oregon I was just mentioning. He wrote an awesome essay called The 6 Myths of Interdisciplinarity that I'm drawing from, and obviously he had an effect on me, right? He challenges the myth that problem solving is the purview of scientists, while communicating science is the purview of artists and humanists. Scientists are busy finding out the facts about how the world works, but they are not especially good at communicating their findings to policymakers and to the public. So this narrative goes. Humanists could play their part by crafting compelling metaphors, by writing music and plays and poems that get people in touch with nature again and that communicate what scientists have learned about. How many of you guys thought that this is what artists and humans are supposed to do, right? Yeah, exactly. You thought that's what you were coming here to hear about, right? No, we're not going to go out and read Thoreau together. The distribution of labor here is clear. The real work of understanding reality belongs to empirical research, but humanists can handle the public relations work of spreading the message. Implicit in this myth is that the arts and sciences are, in the myth that they are the PR, is the notion that scientific endeavors are purely about revealing truths. As political ecologist Paul Robbins and his co-authors of Environment and Society argue, science is a method for finding truths already out there, natural laws, or the natural properties of things. Yet, he argues, the humanities turns this fundamental assumption of science on its head by insisting that scientific knowledges are made in historically specific, socially situated practices rather than found. Toadvine similarly argues that environmental crises are not problems that we, quote, stumble over like objective things lying on the ground. Problems are only problems for someone, from some perspective, and in relation to certain values. The problem-solving methods of the sciences, he goes on, are no more important to solving problems than the methods of the arts and humanities. We cannot assume that environmental problems are just given, independently of context or values, and independently of any disciplinary assumptions, end quote. In sum, scientific conclusions emerge not from some material reality only, but also from cultural, political, economic, and ideological contexts. The natural sciences are always already shaped by human institutions, histories, and values, rather than being apolitical and value-free. So here's where the interdisciplinary field of risk perception is really fun. How humans perceive problems they think are worth trying to study and solve has to do with certain criteria, according to risk theorists. Back to Paul Slovic, who he found that humans fear hazards that are involuntary and uncontrollable, for example, more so than those that are not. It turns out that knowing cold hard facts about the probability of a particular hazard has little to do with people's fear of that hazard or decision making about it. And so you can see where some of the disconnect might be happening here around climate change. Like facts about the environment, we don't just stumble upon hazards. Perception of them is mediated, and it helps to examine the context in which they emerge as risky. In terms of the crisis of climate change, risk theory can help explain how the slow, gradual, and often imperceptible effects don't mobilize our fight or flight instincts as effectively as, say, a shark attack might. Somewhere between reality, that it's a real hazard, and the myriad interpretations of reality, a lot of confusing forces mediate our sense of whether it counts as a crisis. Forces that I'm arguing humanists and artists are well equipped to explain and help us overcome, so that we can prioritize where to begin tackling this wicked problem. If this is true, then shouting louder from a higher soapbox about the melting ice caps, which I feel like I'm getting deaf to, right, is a waste of hot air. It's not getting anyone to change any minds, and it's just adding more heat into the climate. Just kidding, just kidding. If problems are contextual and relative, and this is Toadvine, then the primary task of the humanities is not to contribute tools to the problem-solving toolbox, which is usually how interdisciplinarity is constructed in institutions, and that might even be the way you guys do it here, I don't know. But instead to provide an entirely different perspective by which the construction of problems is itself interrogated. That creates a lot of disagreement. Whoops, sorry. Where am I? Whoa, going the wrong way, sorry. Okay, getting ahead of myself. The concern here is not with the gathering of facts, go to the data, but rather with the assumptions that frame what counts as a fact and the broader context that determines which facts are gathered and how they are put to use. Okay. What about this word? Told you I was going to deconstruct this title, right? The notion that there's only one crisis, as I hint in this word, reveals another problematic assumption, which relates to another sneaky little word in the title, our. a humanist would immediately identify this word our and the relatedly singular noun crisis as a concern. We like to call this move the universalizing move. Anybody know about that? See, jargon. Is the crisis the same for all? Do different people experience the crisis differently? Is there possibly more than one crisis, depending on these different perspectives of it? When we assume a problem is shared equally by all, we ignore all these different perspectives. It's like saying humanity's appetite for fossil fuels is the root cause of climate change. Has anybody ever said that? Maybe a few of you. Maybe. I know I've said it. Or maybe humanity sucks. Has anybody said that? Yeah. Okay. I hear that a lot. Yeah. Oh, God. Without thinking about the diversity of humans and their relationships with nature. Some humans really do suck, even if they don't know it. If fossil fuel consumption is the way that we want to determine whether someone sucks or not, as implied in the ecological footprint exercise that my colleagues do. Has anybody ever done that? Ecological footprint exercise? Yeah, measure your ecological footprint. It makes you feel like you suck, right? They maybe have greater access to fossil fuels than others, right? So that disparity between who has access to fossil fuels or who has access to different extractive practices is ignored in that universalizing move, right? So when I put the word our into my title, I made an egregious and dangerous error. I erased the social, economic, geographic, temporal, ethnic, religious, age, sexual, gender disparities or differences between me and everybody else. I assumed everybody's like me and feels the same way about this crisis. Everybody in this room here may agree that there's one obvious environmental crisis out there, but that story does not speak to everybody's experiences, and it kind of explains why we're having some problems around this issue, right? So, for example, my climate scientist colleague insists that we cannot physically perceive climate change, but there are many communities that say that they do. They might be profoundly insulted to be told by this privileged white climate scientist guy that what they perceive to be true is not true. The universalizing move asks audiences to not believe what their very bodies are telling them about the world. And why would we ask people to ignore connections between climate change and the truths of their daily lives? For example, the fact that, bioaccumulation of toxins in their subsistence foods is causing them cancer. Or the fact that people can physically perceive having to move because of rising sea levels. Of course, my colleague meant that humans cannot perceive climate changing because it occurs over half a lifetime and we don't usually have the ability to remember changes of weather that long ago. But some people might say they can. Some indigenous scholars might argue that memory inheres in oral histories. And it's exemplary of the siloing of my colleague that he could not imagine, outside of his own lived experience, how his comment might land on people who think they perceive climate change. Only somebody who is not perceiving the effects of climate change would declare as a universal truth that climate change cannot be felt. Hence, the universalizing move, which is so common in environmental thought, humanity sucks, right, obscures a great inequality, that the communities most responsible for climate change are the ones most able to evade its effects, for the time being anyway. And so no wonder there's cultural disagreement about this. If we want more people to care and act, then we've got to avoid universalizing and trying to jam our definition of the problem down everyone's throats. We have to try to grasp how other people are perceiving this hazard, if not in the same frames that we are. We have to figure out how to make connections between their crises and this one. We hear a lot these days from liberal bleeding hearts about needing to have empathy for people who felt so under threat that they voted for Donald Trump in 2016. I totally disagree. It is not empathy we need. It is humility. Humility that my views are actually shaped by forces. They're not rooted in some sort of truth. It's not just objective truth because I have some special access to it. I need to strive how these forces have shaped my version of the crisis. And coupled with this humility and self-reflection, we need agility of argumentation, and this is not what I mean by, I don't mean better cheerleading, right? Different types of arguments will work differently on different people depending on their notions of risk. This has nothing to do with climate change. This has entirely to do with underlying values and people's stories about what they fear. Humanists and artists can help us acquire this rhetorical agility and humility that's required to break through the culture war that we are in now. Crisis. A humanist wants to know not just whether there's a crisis, but whether or not solving a crisis can be helped by some further critical questioning about how we've come to understand that we're experiencing a crisis, what we call framing. We think it's valuable to push against the ways that people come to think of a hazard as an urgent crisis, and to challenge the way that crisis frame asks us to stop thinking. How can we push back reactionary impulses of crisis? We ask questions like, who says we're in a crisis? Who benefits from cries of crisis? Who loses? What kind of cultural work does a crisis frame do? Alarmism about crisis may in fact do more harm than good by asking us, for example, to surrender civil rights in favor of the so-called global greater good, or by preventing us from spending the time it takes to really understand and strategize about these problems, especially if you want to keep living in a democratic society. When something is in crisis, we are in the triage room. Attention is mobilized. Less urgent ailments take longer time to get attention. The environmental movement has worked hard to deploy crisis rhetoric to push climate to the front of the line by framing the amorphous, seemingly distant, seemingly imperceptible risks of climate change as worthy of immediate attention. This has been really good. I applaud that. But we leverage the appeal of something like a spectacular weather event, like a hurricane, to prove that climate change is happening, right? There is a spectacular thing, it's a hazard, it's right there, it's connected, you know? But this is why the right gets so annoyed and accuses us of being opportunistically political whenever there's a natural disaster. This is so frustrating. In addition to the fact that this kind of argument is backfiring in public discourse, there are some negative side effects and unintended consequences of the doom and gloom narrative. This kind of apocalypticism, as exemplified, remember this one? Remember this guy? Remember this movie? I love this. This is a hockey stick thing, a hockey puck thing, whatever it's called. And there's Al Gore up there, right? Remember he did that? How many guys have seen this movie, right? All my students have seen Inconvenient Truth. There's going to come a time when nobody has seen that, and I don't know. It'll be a good or bad thing, I don't know. Okay, a whole genre of dystopic cultural productions, now Leonardo DiCaprio is doing it, you know, everybody's doing it, is increasingly regarded as doing more harm than good. For example, Richard Eckersley writes, "The sense of the world as threatening and hostile produces a fraying of citizenship and democracy, as well as a vulnerability to the politics of self-interest and fear." Sound familiar? The dramatic imagery of apocalypse is a dystopian story that, quote, can hinder the development of particular responses, especially ones that might be gradual rather than urgent. Cultural critic Greg Girard also observes that crisis narratives polarize responses, sound familiar? Prodding skeptics, he writes, towards scoffing dismissal and potentially inciting believers to confrontation and even violence. Apocalyptic rhetoric also fosters a delusive search for culprits and causes, he writes. So the backlash we worry about now is apocalypse fatigue, right? Anybody feel this way? I feel that way. I'm really tired. And eco-nihilism, right? Wanting to just, as the motto goes, kill yourself, save the planet, or whatever, right? Have you seen that? Social scientists, artists, psychologists, and rhetoricians are all frantically researching whether shame, guilt, fear, despair, nihilism are effective in promoting social and personal change. That's important work. Crisis rhetoric can also encourage socially oppressive policies. In the triage scenario, all kinds of luxuries, like civil rights, can be suspended. Environmental studies scholar Janet Fischio observes how crisis narratives often rely on assumptions about human nature as selfish, and the dystopia that we're entering, a kind of lifeboat scenario following Garrett Hardin. in which the privileged can consolidate their own power and come to see not their own actions, but the people most vulnerable to climate change as the greater threat. The urgency of a declining world makes people scramble to find their spot on the lifeboat. They can fall prey to nationalism, nativism, isolationism, and regressive economic and social policies. Do you see where I'm going with this? The crisis of climate change ought to result in a rejection of fossil fuel dependency, right? Not fear and further oppression of the very people that climate change is already affecting. But in an emergency situation, sometimes it's hard to think. And people might want to do the easy thing and retreat to defensive posturing and isolationist politics. We may be in a crisis, but we really do need to be thoughtful about how we use the crisis narrative and how others may use our sense of urgency for repressive goals. So, given how awesome these things are that the humanities and artistic forms of knowledge production offer, why have the arts and humanities been not seriously enlisted in addressing our climate crisis? Don't you want to know? I want to know. Why are we in the back seat? Why are we in the trunk? Why would I have to be thinking about this every day in my work, every parent I talk to, every student I meet, every administrator I talk to, fighting for resources over it? Arts and humanities have something to offer, Why would I even make the title of this talk? Why would you even be sitting here listening? I've been showing you, by way of deconstructing the title of my talk, the methods and contributions in the humanities. I'll turn to the arts more fully too, but right now I want to think about explaining why the arts and humanities have been relegated to the back seats and trunks of this car that we're ostensibly driving toward utopia. It surprises me that so many people think that the arts and humanities have nothing to do with the environment, except perhaps as science's cheerleaders. I'm surprised in part because it invalidates my entire area of expertise, which, true, is about my own ego. But I've come to understand that this assumption is worse than just a poke in my eye. I'm so surprised that people presumably who care so much about the environment would push nature so far away from human life by thinking that only the natural sciences can give us any knowledge of it. This assumption that the natural sciences have the monopoly on knowledge about nature hides a problem that is greater than the disciplinary turf wars that I've been discussing so far. And it's greater, I think, than even the corporatization of the university. Problems that I would concede are really huge threats to democracy and free thought, much less the environment. What I'm really concerned about is that this confusion about who has the authority to produce knowledge about the environment shows how Western culture has made nature yet again into something that exists out there, away from human and social activity. As a recent Ecologist magazine op-ed put it, even using the word environment implies a sense of detachment, as if the natural world is somehow out there, separated and detached from us humans. Oddly, nature doesn't seem to include Homo sapiens. I would contend that this belief that nature is or should be detached from human activity is at the root of our climate problem. In other words, I'm not trying to carve out disciplinary territory here. I'm trying to manifest a livable climate change future, in part by showing you how damaging the disciplinary divisions and the assumptions underlying them are. Let me explain. Following many humanists, scholars, and artists, I agree that the human-nature dualism, which is distinct to Western Enlightenment thought, shapes how industrialized societies have come to treat nature. Feminist historian Carolyn Merchant refers to this as the death of nature. When Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, ostensibly he took the animus out of the material world, and nature became a machine for human use. The problems with Cartesian dualism are myriad. William Cronin's famous essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, makes what I think is the most important point, which is that as long as we value the idea of nature that is apolitical, anachronistic, all that is not human, non-social, and otherwise out there, such as is inherent in the concept of wilderness, then we ignore the many ways that nature is actually everywhere. We are breathing it right now. It is swimming around in our guts. Our breast milk and our eyelids are in symbiosis with nature as we speak. This microphone and that screen came from nature. some extracted landscape I'm happy to sacrifice as long as some beautiful ones are preserved as wilderness. If we had the capacity to understand and see nature everywhere, even in the ugliest things and in the dirtiest of places, we might take better care of the places that we live, work, play, and pray, as environmental justice scholars put it. Along those lines, indigenous decolonial scholars would further argue that the colonial legacy of the Americas has been an ongoing process of separating humans from nature, and that the idea of wilderness itself has been a form of environmental injustice, as it dispossessed indigenous Americans from their land, justified their forced settlement, and criminalized migratory subsistence practices. As T.J. Demos puts it, the colonization of nature, emerging from the Enlightenment principles of Cartesian dualisms, situated the non-human world as objectified, passive, and separate. In this context, the field of ecology emerged as what its founder called a science of empire. So, to sum up, the thinking of nature as something outside of human activity, as an idea and a material thing that is only valuable to the extent that is pure of humanity's touch, is that it allows us to ignore that nature is right here, to trash nature as long as that trash is out of sight, to keep any non-recreational human activity out of nature. Universalizing humanity as needing to be separate from nature makes it easy for us to ignore the myriad ways that humans have, can, and do continue to support ecosystems in their values and practices. Let me put this point another way. If we accept that nature and humans are interconnected, then we also have to accept that nature is not out there, and that the study of it will entail every discipline and form of knowledge production, even and especially from those emerging from outside the academy. So this chip on my shoulder that you might have been detecting about being thrown in the trunk or the back seat and being asked to cheerlead for science, yeah, it's also just not about my ego. It is a little bit about my ego. It does get me ruffled. But I've come to think about what's really bugging me here is the inherent residual colonial Cartesian assumptions about dividing humans from nature that actually create all kinds of exploitation and destruction of humans and nature across the planet. So far, I've tried to show you and not just tell you what the arts and humanities can do, or at least the humanities, can do for our environmental crisis. They may do a great job of what we thought this talk was going to be about communicating, translating, and narrating the crisis to the masses and getting people to love nature more. But they also provide all these other things, new ways of understanding the problems. Rather than being the consummate problem solvers, as environmental scientists are known to be, environmental humanists would rather be problem creators, reframing the very terms of the problems that we're setting about to solve. They hold the potential to reveal the ways that crisis narratives are as much about ordering society, deflecting responsibility, and consolidating power as they are about saving nature. And perhaps one thing they can do that we haven't discussed so far is to equip us with the imaginative, affective, and aesthetic tools to deal with our various environmental futures, and, dare we dream it, to even thrive in the Anthropocene. So I want to turn now to a more specific consideration of the arts. And as I'm not myself an artist nor an arts scholar, I won't pretend to do this growing and thriving and robust world of eco-art any justice in this talk. But I love it. I love it. And I do think a lot about what I'm spending a lot of time with my students thinking about is creativity as a form of resistance. So creativity can look like a lot of different things. If artists are not just there to translate science to the public, what can they do? Here I would turn to the role of the imagination and rescue it from the insulting assumption that it's just child's play. Kari Norgaard puts the case for a better imagination this way. There are two types of imagination we need. We need to be able to see the relationship between human actions and their impacts on the Earth's biophysical system. Call it the ecological imagination. The second form of seeing is a sociological imagination. The scientific community has made great progress in developing our ecological imagination. Yet despite those urgent warnings, the social and political response to climate change remains wholly inadequate. This more interdisciplinary challenge has been a harder nut to crack. A symptom of how underdeveloped our sociological imagination is relative to our ecological imagination is the recent finding that more Americans can imagine the end of the world than can envision a switch from using fossil fuels or an economic order other than capitalism. This blows my mind. Is your mind blown? We cannot imagine a future without fossil fuel or capitalism, but we can imagine, like, the Terminator, right? So I did an experiment with my students to see if this is true. I asked them to visualize a future where they're thriving in the Anthropocene. Let me tell you how many reasons they came up with for why they couldn't do that. It is heartbreaking. What are we asking our students to live for? One of my favorite writers, Rebecca Solnit, would argue that this lack of imagination aids and is the result of capitalism. She bemoans what she calls the privatization of imagination. Do you remember that guy in the beginning of the talk with his car analogy? She bemoans that it's been co-opted by capitalism's values of individualism and materialism, and argues that this prevents us from imagining collective futures without capitalism as we know it. Art can mobilize people to think and act in ways that data, cold hard facts, and numbers cannot. Artists and humanists can help us figure out how climate change comes to matter, as in the title of Candace Callison's 2014 book, How Climate Change Comes to Matter, The Communal Life of Facts, and how it moves from being about data to being about social action. The arts not only hold up mirrors to problems in society and in ourselves, they help us to figure out how to persuade people that their imaginations even need reclaiming, to develop sociological imaginations about post-fossil fuel futures, and to equip us with the desire for that future. Humanists and social science scholars are producing research to explain why climate change is hard for people to care about, such as George Marshall's Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, or John Mayer's Engaging the Everyday, Environmental Social Criticism and the Resonance Dilemma. And of course, hot off the press, Yale Climate Change Communications 2017 update report on climate change in the American mind, which you'll learn so much about why Americans, what they think about climate change in here. So artists are in a powerful position to get around these problems that are outlined in all of this research. Rob Nixon, for example, calls on artists to find ways to narrate the long emergency of climate change, what he calls slow violence, so that people will perceive it as a risk in ways that they currently do not. What kinds of narratives and stories will enable us to grasp the temporally elusive perceptions of climate change? Which is why my climate change scientist colleague was trying to articulate that. What kinds of art will make us care about myriad forms of slow violence? Violence that is displaced across the planet and into the future, which our actions right now are putting into motion. T.J. Demos's book, Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology, documents a flourishing artistic and activist set of practices that are seeking to address environmental conflict and make up for the lack of governmental action. An assemblage of cultural productions in broadcast media, experimental video and film, internet-based and independent news, creative activism, NGOs, and collective social movements comprise what Demos calls a complex aesthetic field that is politically organized and which contests dominant frames of environmental crisis by showing how some voices clearly count and others are relegated to the sensory background. An economically determined, anti-democratic arrangement that activist artists are continually challenging. Demos concludes that art helps people form alliances, create social movements, and make visible publics that counter corporate and governmental positions through their creative engagements with media. Sign me up for some of that. That sounds good. I want to conclude by arguing that true interdisciplinarity would reject the very title of my talk, not to mention the car analogy I opened up with, obviously. Just adding some artists and humanists and even social scientists into the car, into existing environmental frames that are already predetermined and defined by the natural sciences, is not going to do the trick. Here we see how the arts and humanities can do much more than translate science to the public. Hartman explains, to turn to expert humanities researchers not for their depth of their knowledge concerning values and ethics or historical trends in human thought and behavior, but for their ability to translate a highly technical scientific message into the popular idiom is not unlike engaging an accomplished composer to tune your guitar. I love that. I love that one. I like have that one, in my journal. Makes me feel good. We need a vision of interdisciplinarity that's messy, upsetting, uncomfortable, nothing like the siloed towers of authority that academia currently asks us to perform. This will take creative administrators and different budget arrangements, really boring bureaucratic stuff. Doesn't feel like solving our urgent crisis, I'll tell you that. Only that kind of interdisciplinarity that shapes how it is that students are receiving and producing their own knowledge about this crisis can bring together seemingly opposing ways of approaching our problems, numbers and narratives, logic and emotion, the individual and the collective. Only this multi-way exchange of knowledge co-production among disciplines and from outside the academy can challenge dualisms, reframe narratives, deconstruct power relations, understand how climate and cultural change works, and empower a variety of communities defining environmental issues in a range of ways to thrive in a climate change future. We need co-teaching. We need incentives to be humble and flexible about what counts as knowledge in our fields. We need problem-driven rather than discipline-driven curricula. We need new institutional arrangements that can create the conditions for this kind of work. But we needn't wait around for institutions to change either. After all, they are reflections of our cultural norms, and we can get busy working on those anytime. I'd like to start one student at a time, like that student from UVO, and help them reclaim their imagination by showing them that the very way they understand the world is shaped by narrative, as is evidenced by that car analogy. Narrative is just that powerful. I can start by figuring out better ways to articulate what the humanities and arts bring to environmental problems. I'm trying to do that right now. We can all start by envisioning the futures we want. Adrienne Marie Brown, in my favorite book right now, you should get it, it's really good, Emergence Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, articulates what we can all do this way. And so I'll end with her powerful words. Art is not neutral. It either upholds or disrupts the status quo, advancing or regressing justice. We are living now inside the imagination of the people who thought economic disparity and environmental destruction were acceptable costs of their power. It is our right and responsibility to write ourselves into the future. All organizing is science fiction. If you are shaping the future, you are a futurist. You have worlds inside you. Thank you. Question? I think
There's a microphone.
there's a microphone, right? Okay. Is it getting passed around or is it stationary?
Check, check.
Okay. You can go ahead and ask a question. I'll repeat
mic.
it. How's that? Yeah.
Oops. Sorry for calling. Oh.
One thing when there's so many things. Those are two questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I got really excited about thinking about this recently. Social media and art to me is amazing because it makes it so consumable and so easily dispersed. Obviously, net neutrality is a really big thing right now. So it concerns me, excites me.
So can you live with that both and? You're going to do good if you can. Concerning, so the speed and volume of that dissemination and that accessibility is concerning and exciting. And I really think you're probably in a better position to answer that question because you obviously have been thinking about it. So I'd like you to come up here and to give that talk because that's a very important talk. And one of the, I worry about thinking about artists as people whose job it is to disseminate the message. So what I would like us to think about is how is that medium and that content producing a new way of thinking, producing a new form of knowledge? That's an interesting question to me.
Do you feel like that's the future, is like art through social media?
It sure is one. It sure is one. Because if we have net neutrality and we have all these other, we don't want to have only one feather in our cap. What's that analogy? Yeah, see, I don't like metaphors. We only have one, we don't want to have one tool, right? We don't want to have one way to resist dominant forms of knowledge production. So social media and art in that form sure seems fantastic while we've got it. Let's work it. Yeah. I don't do it, but I love that other people do. Did I answer? So the question there, I'm sorry, the question for those, I meant to repeat your question was social media, art, good or bad, concerning, exciting, what? Okay, discuss. Can you see hands? I can't see anything. Oh, way up in the back. Yeah.
Hello.
Oh, there you are.
We read The Ecological Other in our program, and I really appreciated the idea of, that was great, the idea of problematizing the issues as opposed to developing solutions, creating nuance and a range of ways of understanding as opposed to this is the truth or this is the story. But we're living in a time where people are calling all facts into question, and so coming at that by making it even more muddled or more complicated seems somewhat self-defeating in a way. Can you speak to ways of making the problems more nuanced and complicated while still addressing the need to come to some sort of agreement about what reality is?
Yeah. Well, do you think that we've ever successfully done that quite yet? Yeah, so I don't see that happening. But so this, I'm probably not answering your question, but I want to go off on a riff of something I do care a lot about, because that's what you do. It's called the pivot, isn't that what it's called? Many of my students worry that the message isn't being spread enough. You heard that in my talk today, and that we need some sort of critical mass, right? We have this, democracy has shaped our brains to thinking that we need a certain number of people to get change to happen. But depending on your interpretation of various historical social movements, one could argue that you don't need that, right? If you even look at the current president and the election process there, that even defies the question of numbers. So I'm not terribly interested in consensus, not because I don't believe in democracy, don't get me wrong, but because I think social change happens in much more complicated ways, and getting just a certain number of people to vote or move in a particular direction or take an action would have taken a ton of other things happening that build up to that moment. And all that counts as social change to me too, and that's all happening right now as we speak. And so I worry about my students expecting or hoping for some future that is happening right now. And the work that they're doing is the work. It's not going to happen in some future when we have a collective critical mass. You know, all of our activities are going to tip over the ship or something. You know, I don't think social change happens that way, and I worry about theories that narrate it that way. That doesn't really answer your question, but kind of gets to it.
Can you speak more about jobs, like involving the arts and humanities and environmental work?
Yeah, I'll try. Because the obvious answer is that it's grim, right? But that's always been the case, right? When I got a religious studies degree, everybody asked me, "What kind of job can you get with that?" Oh, I'm going to try to get a job, I swear. So as a program leader, I'm accountable to that question for environmental studies students, and our students are trained in arts, humanities, social sciences, not the natural sciences. And they are trained with a social justice analysis. And those things don't feel hireable to them. They wonder, how am I going to get a job? I have science envy. I'm not going to get one of those jobs. So I tell them to read this great book called So You Majored in What? That's the title, I swear. And do the work that's in the book to equip yourself to be a passionate, skilled individual that can articulate that to people who might want your skills. There's a lot of information out there and data, you can look this up, on the environmental studies programs making good cases for the fact that a lot of the jobs that are going to hire students from these kinds of intersectional, interdisciplinary programs haven't been created yet. And so I do a sort of an incredible acrobatic act with my students to try to help them search current jobs and imagine themselves in these fields, but I also want to keep their minds wide open. In fact, most of my students sort of think that if a job will pay them to do it, even though they need it, they've got student loans and debt and they need to pay the bills, but they have this sort of inherent suspicion about, and this might be an evergreen thing too, about if it's a job that pays, it's from capitalism, so they're selling their souls or something. So it's like this conflict, like, get a job, don't get a job, fix capitalism and then get a job, I don't know. But the sort of more optimistic take on that is that it's really fun to see. So the program that I'm running has only had majors for a couple of years, and it's really fun to see the jobs they're getting and how they come back and talk about, I articulated my skill set this way, and these people never knew they wanted that, but now they know they want that, and now I've got a job. And it comes down to that book, So You Majored in What? Learning how to articulate your skill set confidently. And say, I bring this intersectional analysis. I can do interdisciplinarity, and you know what interdisciplinarity does? It helps me communicate across different stakeholders. Right? I mean, there's ways to translate the outcomes that are listed, in our program materials into like hireable, marketable skill sets. I just hate that language. I have to do it though, I have to do it. I owe that to students too. So my answer to you is, yeah, the better you are at articulating what you can bring and how important that is in the world, power to you.
Thank you. And more a follow-up than a question, but if people want to take a look at Patagonia's website, under careers, there's both paid internships and jobs that absolutely call on communication skills, IT skills, sustainability skills, not advocating a certain company, but it's a real model for exactly the things that Sarah just shared with us.
It's really fun to hear students who are just a year or two out of college saying, I work at the co-op and they didn't have a sustainability or a social justice person, so I told them they needed it and they made this job for me. And I'm like, oh, keep doing that, and that's wonderful.
Hi, Sarah. I also want to thank you and thank the fact that you thank other people in your presentation because connections are very important. So I will have a question in the sense of how is it easy, since it's easier for me to invoke imagination in my peers, how could I bring imagination back into the dense deterministic screens of certain adults?
How can you say that last thing again?
How to bring imagination back into the dense deterministic screens of certain adults, and aiding fluidity and connections, and to better relate and understand between each other through, since different ages we've experienced different issues, and so would I utilize more old forms of imagination works to interest them rather than using analogies and metaphors?
Yeah. It sounds like you have answers to that question better than I can give you. But what you're speaking to is something that rhetoricians are trying to teach students at the 100 level in comp classes, right? Which is that everything depends on your audience, right? And so what I would tell an artist or any student is that righteousness in your position doesn't change anybody's minds or reclaim anybody's imagination. But that's what we see modeled around us, and that's all we consume in our media, more or less. And that's how we're told to interact with our loved ones and our children and our partners and our parents. And that kind of righteousness is the opposite of what we need to do that. And so if you set that aside and you think, where are you coming from? What do you fear? What do you value? What sense of humor do you have? What works for you? What doesn't? What's your positionality? That kind of imagination about what another person's position is, people want to call it empathy. I just don't think that's the right word. That is so critical to adjusting and tailoring your arguments, whether they're about reclaiming imagination or whether they're about climate change, to any particular audience. And so it's interesting, one of my students, when I did that exercise about visioning the future, one of my students thought she was going to go be a photojournalist, and she completely ditched it and said, I'm going to set my entire agenda in my life around reclaiming radical imagination. I don't know how I'm going to do that. I'm going to find a job doing it, and I'm going to go around doing it. And it's like, okay, start right now, right here with us. You take over. And that, for her, that's going to take an incredible awareness of where people are coming from.
Hi. So you say that you don't think empathy is the right word to describe, like understanding where other people are coming from. Well, no, I don't. I'm not mad. I just want to know if there is a word that you think does describe that, or if that's just like we should invent a whole new word.
Let's invent a new word.
Like snuffleupagus or something.
Yeah, you just invent it. Because the words that we haven't given us the answers we need, right? But I was offering in my paper humility as a better one. I don't think it's the best one. But I think that rather than think about other people as the sort of like victim of bad thinking, that the process of getting them to change their view would start with turning the reflection on ourselves. And so I think that's, whatever that's called, it has to do with us, not them, right? If you come up with a word, let me know.
Loved your talk. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
I'm thinking about Charles Keeling, and he's collecting all this data from Maui and the Antarctic, and that data has been so powerful and formative for our understandings of climate change. And one of the things we've been looking at in our course is all this collecting data, and collecting objects from all over the world. This kind of gets centered in places like Europe. But there's some value in that too, but it also comes out of this elitism of art. I mean, when they're collecting these objects, like we were talking about Ferrante Imperato and his cabinet of curiosity, and all these objects, are just about status, but they're art, right? So I think there's a certain fear of elitism and fear of the beautiful. Maybe you could speak to that.
I'll try. I don't, because I'm not thinking about archives and collections in my own thinking, I'm not quite sure where to go with that. But fear of beauty I can think about. And elitism, beauty associated with elitism, you getting at that? Yeah, I think that is true. And I think that's a problem. I think I have two answers around the data and the sort of quantity thing you talk about. And then the beauty thing. They're probably not answering your question, but the data thing is, I do conclude, like the Slovics, that we need them both, right? But we need to be thoughtful about in what context we value which one and why. And so there's strategic narratives that draw on certain people's assumptions about what counts as fact or truth or epistemology. And there's not just one right one or another. They're tools we can use to try to, make meaning in the world. So I'm not rejecting facts, I guess, is the answer there. Or data or numbers. It's probably not what you're asking, but okay. And then around beauty, my trouble with beauty is not that it's associated with elitism, although there is that. And we should change that, right? We should do our work to change that. But my trouble with that is that I worry about the fate of that which is perceived as, or constructed as, or is framed as ugly. And so this is why Slavoj Žižek, I love this video of him, Philosophy in the Streets, where he goes to the dump and he says, if you really want to be an ecologist, you got to get really comfortable in the dump. And I love it. I'm like, oh, well, I'm not comfortable in the dump. I don't like litter. Leave no trace, guys, right? But the ugly is more interesting to me, I guess. What we do with the ugly. And Mary Davis talks about dirt being matter, that which is out of place, rather than really actually a thing. So I'm really interested in thinking about how we even come to think of what is beautiful and what's ugly, and how it then translates into what we think is worthy of saving or not. That's more my thing. And you probably can run with that in some way in your field. I don't know. No, maybe not. Totally unrelated to your question. Sorry. Maybe we could pick it up afterwards.
Since this is art's effect on the environment, and a lot of art requires destruction, like a lot of artistic materials such as paint, glass, metal, wood, paper, technology, all has an extremely negative effect on the environment. So how do we, I don't know, just kind of...
Make art?
Yeah, make art without destroying the environment as well.
Do you have an answer to that? Do you do that?
That's a question that I've been asking myself a lot lately.
So have you stopped doing art because you're worried about what it does to the environment?
No, but I'm having that kind of like battle within myself. It's like I love the environment and I would love to be like do everything I can to save the environment, but the way my brain works doesn't allow me to do the work that needs to be done. You're
worried about your impure soul. Yes, yeah. I understand.
Pretty much.
Okay. I'm not trying to tease you. Everything I'm doing right now has environmental impact, right? I got on a plane to get here, right? Call me out on that. That's true. And my students will say, Sarah, what are you doing to save the environment? And I'm like, I'm sitting here in front of you, working through the stuff with you. Isn't that good enough? Jeez, I have chickens. Is that good? I don't know. What do they want? I'm like dying. I'm, up at night worrying about them. Isn't that saving the environment? I don't know. So my invitation is to allow some of that hypocrisy to just be there. Because we're going to leave an impact, whether we like it or not. And so that leave no trace kind of nihilism thing that makes students basically, I have a student who basically wants to starve herself out of existence, right? I mean, she's associating her history of body image and eating disorders with her environmental message she's been getting. I mean, she can connect these things beautifully. She's reported on it and published on it and written about it and done a lot of research about it, and it's been very therapeutic for her, I hope. But that nihilism is very destructive to us, and I would suggest that we are going to have an impact. We're going to use resources. So, how can you do art that critiques the use of resources? Wouldn't that be cool? What does that look like? And B, you're going to use some resources. And how can you square that in your own moral life? You're going to have to figure that out yourself. But I think there is a lot of fantastic art that does not have a lot of impact, and that's kind of what makes it environmental art, some of it. Not all environmental art does a good job of not using resources, obviously.
Hello. I worry a lot about chickens too, but so I was thinking, on the one hand, you were talking about this sort of continuation of artists that have this need or like message to get us back to nature or like connect us with these things, and that sort of falls short really often. I guess it's just a really liberal, progressive thing. Maybe it's kind of disconnected, but then there's also I was thinking that we were talking about jobs that and this is the opposite end, where like if you're going to try and be at the most useful position and also have that be your only means of like getting money, to be able to create a change, that message then becomes, like, say you're in communications or something, like you're like a designer or whatever, trying to send a message, that becomes politicized and then sort of becomes divisive. And not automatically, not all the time, but I worry that maybe on both ends, so neither of these are enough. Seems like I'd want to reimagine everything about my life and then place art into how it would be in the future, I guess. Hope I'm not answering my own question, but I guess I'm asking, is our jobs really enough for us to, as artists or communicators or anything, is that enough to actually make the change or imagine the changes we want?
How much you have in you to give to all of this is really going to be up to you. And whether or not you can make a job out of it or not, or maybe you do extracurricular stuff out of it or not, or maybe you don't have jobs at all and you're just full-time activist. I don't know. I mean, is it ever enough? No. And the whole point of students' despair around the scale of our environmental crisis is that sense of inefficacy, right? It's never enough. It's never going to be enough. How can one individual, even if they did it day and night and made up a new job that did that, or, found the silver bullet and, did it, that probably wouldn't be enough. And so this sort of like, is that enough, feels to me a really potentially toxic question. Because the answer will always be, there's never enough, and then you're going to like burn out by the time you're 21, right? I don't know how old you are, but I'm just saying that like young people are in this question all the time. It's never enough. I can't do it all myself. And so one of the things I try to argue that the humanities and arts can do is to show us how many other people are doing this work so that we can take a rest sometimes, We're not the only ones out there saving the planet. There's a whole ton of people trying to do this, so sleep, And so I don't know if that's what you're asking, but we are all going to have to. I'm fortunate. I have a job that allows me to do this kind of work, but it's not saving the planet in a ways that lots of people would say I should be. So we all have to kind of find our way of doing it, and then save ourselves so that we can do it for the long haul. And whatever structure that we're in to do the work that we want to do, you find your workaround ways the best you can do it. But we're not going to be morally pure about all of our work forever and ever. And sometimes we have to stop doing the work and, go get a sustainable pedicure or whatever it is. I don't know. You know what I mean? Self-care, whatever it is, go pet the chickens. That feels good. I love that. They make these noises. Okay. I don't know if that answered your question. I'm sorry.
Through your progress with this idea and bringing it to fruition, what artists have impressed upon you the great leaps forward in ideas visually that have kind of said, "Oh, that's it"? Is there any particular?
Oh gosh, I'm not an artist.
A few.
There are. who are in this room probably know much better people. I have written about two forms of art that I can only speak to them just as an immediate response, but I find this web interactive documentary that I was talking about in the class this morning called Bear 71 to be a really amazing multi-genre art form that I think the medium of it provokes a lot of really fascinating cutting-edge questions. So I would check out Bear 71 and let your head go on its trip, because it's a trip. And then I've also written about and tried to kind of rescue Edward Bratinsky from his what I consider rejection by environmental justice thinkers. So what I would say about his work is that he's trying to make visible the invisible connections between things and the materiality and vibrancy of inanimate stuff. And, it's really easy for me to disavow, like I was mentioning earlier about the microphone, its whole entire chain of production and where it goes before and after I'm using it. I can just ignore it. So in the time I'm experiencing it, that's all I see. And I love the way he brings out the whole life of things and forces me not to disavow that. So art that does that, I think, is fantastic. Of course, he uses a ton of resources when he's doing that, obviously. And then Bear 71 asks us to think about animals as interconnected with human life in a way that changed the way I think about animal-human relationships. So art that can do that kind of stuff, right? That can raise to our consciousness our interconnections with other stuff and make us feel ethically obliged to that other stuff, inanimate or animate, the non-human or more than human world, is awesome. Because for me, as a Western person, I wasn't trained that way. Many people were trained to think about the world that way, but that's not my positionality. So I enjoy that kind of work.
Hi, over here.
Oh. Am I supposed to, last question? Last question.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you. That's okay.
So for how we want to try and to convince people who don't believe in climate change, is your version of the humanist way trying to collect everyone's truths on how they see climate change and try to put that in some type of visual narrative performance kind of way, since data doesn't seem to be working?
Is it? That sounds great. Do that. Let's see it. I love it. There's this wonderful, I can't remember exactly whose name it is, but he put together this, somebody who knows what this is, please chime in, all the different perspectives on a whale hunt in, I want to say, in Nupiaq territory. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? The whale, it's called The Whale and the Computer or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, the documentary or the web, it's actually an interactive web thing like the Bear 71 thing. It has all the perspectives that are possible on this whale hunt. And there's no narrative. He doesn't narrate anything. You can choose whatever perspective. It's interactive. So he's not forcing a narrative of which one is better on you. And let's see a version of that around truths on climate change. And the other point there is that some people might not be perceiving climate change, but they might think that American moral values are in crisis. Well, we can say, well, American moral values are connected to climate change, and then go from there, right? So how can you then utilize everybody's crises to shift those politics? But I want to see that. That sounds cool. Anyway, thank you very much. That was the last question. Thank you so much for your questions.